Swami Vivekananda, never a man to mince words, he once made a statement that was quite startling, and one that, if we think deeply about it, should keep us up at night. What did he say? He said the following, and for those of you nerds out there who want to know where I'm getting this from, it's from Swami Sharadananda's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna's divine play, Lila Prashango in Bengali. All right, here's what he says. In trying to practice religion, 80% of people turn cheats, and about 15% go crazy. Only the remaining 5% attain the direct spiritual realization of the infinite truth and are blessed. Hence, beware. Look at the percentages there. They're pretty bleak. 80, 15, 5. 5% are sincere spiritual aspirants who eventually realize the ultimate spiritual goal of life. 15% go crazy. 80%, a full 80%, are what he calls cheats. He spoke this in Bengali, and the Bengali word here is juachor, for those of you who know Bengali. I think that's more or less the best translation, cheats. 80% cheats, you might wonder. First of all, the thing that'll keep you up at night is, which category do I fall under? That's what should keep you up at night, each of us up. All right, but once we get over that, we have to ask ourselves, 80% cheats. I mean, we all know that there are cheats in religious life and spiritual life. There are those fake gurus and fake sadhus and who are out to make a quick buck and whatever. But that's not 80%. My suggestion is that this 80% category of cheats encompasses two kinds of people in spiritual life. The first is the obvious kind of cheat, those who deceive others, knowingly. And there are plenty of those, as we know. Kind of fake gurus, fake spiritual guides, fake spiritual teachers. But an even larger, possibly, an even larger percentage of people that fall under this category of cheats are people who don't knowingly deceive others. They don't even necessarily unknowingly deceive others, but they're deceiving themselves. So people who engage in self-deception, unconscious self-deception, fall under this category. And I think that's why it includes 80% of people. Otherwise, it's hard to explain the percentages here. That's at least my suggestion. So what I want to do today is, well, actually, before I move on from Swami Vivekananda's statement, I don't want you guys to freak out here. So there are a few caveats I want to add. The first caveat is that it's not an all or nothing thing. It's not that we're 100% self-deceivers or we're 100% crazy, 100% sincere. Often we're a mixture of things. I think that's probably more realistic in the case of most of us. Just to give you, just one example. One of us might be 50% sincere, 48% self-deceiver, 2% crazy. We're all a little crazy, maybe. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these categories are not airtight and rigid. They're fluid, and we can move between categories. Ideally, we should move between categories. Even if we start out crazy, we should try to move into the sincere spiritual aspirant category. That's the ideal, and ultimately, as I'll come to the end, when I get to the end of the talk, I'll mention again that we'll all come out in the end, fortunately. And we'll all be in the 5% group. Every single one of us without exception. It may not be in this life, that's the catch. And I'm not kidding, because Vedantins believe in karma and rebirth. But we will get there eventually. So that should give us hope and solace and consolation. Because a lot of what I'm going to say might seem a little bleak, but I hope not, because it's all meant to be very practical. So, what is Swami Vivekananda saying? Why is he saying it in such stark terms? Because spiritual life is like walking on the edge of a razor blade. The Razor's Edge is a novel written by Somerset Maugham. And then he starts with that epigraph. From the Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, Kshurasya dhara nishita duratya durgam patastat kavayo vadanti. Spiritual life is like walking on the edge of a razor blade. We'll see why. one of the reasons why is because as spiritual aspirants, we're so prone to self-deception. And so what I want to do today, I want to do three things. First and foremost, I want to look at the different ways that we tend to deceive ourselves. Secondly, so the first is I want to explain 5 general ways that each of us as spiritual aspirants might deceive ourselves. The second part of the talk, I want to discuss each of the 4 yogas in turn, the 4 main spiritual practices in Vedanta. Jnana yoga, Bhakti yoga, Karma yoga, and Raja yoga. I'll explain what all these terms mean when we get to that. And the specific forms that self-deception takes in each of these yogas so that we can kind of watch out for those. And then third and finally is the more constructive and positive side of the talk, which is what positive steps can we take as spiritual aspirants to avoid self-deception in our day-to-day life. So let's begin. I think that there are probably many more than 5. I'm limiting it to 5 here, but you can probably, in the Q&A afterward, we can actually talk about maybe other ways that I missed out. Swami, you missed this way of deceiving ourselves. But I want to talk about 5 here. First one. The first step in spiritual life, and it's not just the first step. This is something that's important in the beginning of spiritual life, in the middle of spiritual life, toward the end of spiritual life. Engaging in brutally honest self-assessment. It's extremely important. Where do we stand from a spiritual standpoint? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Warts and all. And the hardest thing to do is to be honest with ourselves. We'll do the self-assessment, but it'll be overly flattering. Because the ego in each of us, as spiritual aspirants, we have not overcome ego. That the whole purpose of spiritual life is to get over ego and selfishness. The ego is deeply invested in making us think that we're much better, more spiritually evolved than we actually are. And so the tendency is to judge ourselves leniently and to judge others harshly. And the great saints understood this. That's why Jesus said, why are you so busy looking at that splinter in another person's eye? Look at the mote, this giant wooden beam in your own eye. Holy Mother Sharada Devi, the wife of Sri Ramakrishna, she said exactly the same thing. Don't look at the faults of others, look at your own faults. And we might think this is a nice ethical teaching, but there's a deeper, very profound psychological insight behind these teachings. That insight is, by doing that, by engaging in this kind of practice of looking at your own faults, turning the mirror on yourself rather than on others, you are in a better position to avoid self-deception. You can give yourself a brutally honest self-assessment. You can avoid the danger of thinking you're much more spiritually evolved than you really are, which really short-circuits all further spiritual progress. In a marathon, 26.2 miles, if you already think you're at mile 25 and you only have 1.2 miles to go, but you actually haven't even got off the starting line, there's going to be a real problem. Another thing is, we have to be very careful about spiritual ego. And we're going to get to this later when we talk about other forms of self-deception. But after you overcome other forms of egoism, you can fall into the trap of what's called spiritual ego. And you start to develop a spiritual superiority complex. I'm spiritual and therefore I'm better than other people who don't go to the Vedanta Society. And this and that. It's very dangerous, so we all have to be careful about that. More dangerous if you're wearing this. So I'm not exempting myself from any of this. All right, so that's the first main form of self-deception. When we engage in self-assessment, which is absolutely necessary in spiritual life, it becomes overly flattering and not honest. And so we really have to be careful about being honest with ourselves. If we don't trust ourselves, and it's good, if you don't trust yourself, be honest about it, and then turn to someone that you can trust. A loved one, a best friend, maybe a spouse. Kids often help take you down to your size and say, no, Mom, that's not a strength. You're flattering yourself. Whoever it is, whatever it takes, your therapist, they can help you. Don't worry, there are people out there to cut you down to size. All right, second main form that self-deception takes. Big problem these days. I'll use Sanskrit terms, then I'll explain them. It's the tendency to mistake bhoga for yoga. The tendency to mistake bhoga for yoga. It's one of the greatest dangers in our contemporary age. Spirituality has become a kind of marketing craze now. Capitalism recognizes now, advertisers, they get that spirituality is so in now that if we kind of add a little spiritual masala to our product, it'll sell better. And so there are now, in Silicon Valley, there's every big CEO has a guru. There are meditation apps, mindfulness workshops in offices. I'm not saying these are bad things, but I'm talking about dangers. And there's a danger of over-commercialization of spirituality, I think, and kind of watering it down in the process. Self-help books by the hundreds being churned out every year. So the danger is, as spirituality becomes more widespread and mainstream, is that it gets watered down, and what these people promise, these people who are kind of marketing spirituality for the masses, is you can have your cake and you can eat it too. Go ahead and do whatever you're doing already. No need to change anything in your life, but you have the added advantage of calling yourself spiritual. Don't we all want that? Isn't that the dream? Yeah. Fortunately, it's not that easy. Spiritual life's not that easy. So now I come to the Sanskrit terms that I used, and I'll explain them. Bhoga and yoga, two little rhyming words, but they're worlds apart. Bhoga means selfish, worldly, egoistic behavior and thinking. Yoga means spiritual practice. Any practice that aims to reduce selfishness and eliminate ego in our worldly tendencies. And one of the biggest problems in spiritual life is we mistake bhoga for yoga. Let me try to explain what I mean. Let's go back to that same Upanishad I mentioned earlier, Katha Upanishad 1.2.2. Shreyascha preyascha manushyametastau sampariti vivinakti dhiraha. Shreyo hi dhiro vipreyaso vranite preyo mando yogakshemad vranite. Two paths confront every human being. The path of perfection and the path of enjoyment. The wise person, having examined both paths, distinguishes them clearly and chooses the path of perfection instead of the path of enjoyment. The foolish person chooses the path of enjoyment for the sake of selfish and bodily pleasures. That's this mantra. Katha Upanishad 1.2.2. Shankara has a beautiful, very insightful commentary on this mantra. And he says, right at the outset, when we're confronted with these two paths, most people get the signs reversed. They read the bhoga sign for yoga and the yoga sign for bhoga. And so they think they're going on the path to perfection, but it's actually the path of enjoyment. You see how dangerous this is? Right off the bat, they make this fundamental mistake. He says worldly people tend to confuse bhoga for yoga. Because and you might ask why? Well, because the ego is deeply invested in perpetuating itself, and this is the way to do it. Yeah, be spiritual and continue to be egoistic, you see. One of the most common forms, but we can all come up with our own examples of mistaking bhoga for yoga, but one of the most pervasive examples, very, very common, mistaking lust for love. Very, very common. Covering dung with roses. Sorry, that might be a little... Okay, anyway. That's the monk in me. Okay, but the basic point is, many of us think that we're treading on the path of Shreya, the path of perfection, the path of yoga. And instead, the whole time we're on the path of bhoga, the path of enjoyment, the path of worldliness and selfishness without knowing it. And so Shankara says, analyzing this verse word by word in the Sanskrit, Sampaditya, the first step is clearly distinguishing these two paths. Don't underestimate the difficulty and importance of this first step. Clearly distinguishing the path of perfection from the path of enjoyment, the path of Shreya from Preya, the path of yoga from the path of bhoga. Then, secondly, the wise person, Vivinakti, very clearly separates these two paths, like Shankara used the analogy of a swan. Like a swan is able to separate milk from water. This is a common kind of Indian trope. And finally, the wise one chooses to tread the path of perfection rather than the path of enjoyment. Jesus says exactly the same thing. A man cannot serve two masters. You can choose God or mammon, but not both. Swami Vivekananda, when he came to the West, when he came here and in England, knowing full well that he's speaking to a primarily Christian audience, he would tell them, go back to Christ. Go back to Christ, who had nowhere to lay his head upon. That's what he said. He's talking to Christians who call themselves Christians, who go to church, many of them. He says, but you're not Christians. This is mistaking bhoga for yoga. Because in the name of Christianity, you're still engaging in the same, you go to church in order to socialize and find a good husband for your daughter or whatever it is, or because you like hanging out with other people in the same group. This is one of the greatest dangers. Bhagavad Gita talks about the same phenomenon. It gives a very concrete example, also very relevant for today's age. 3.6 of Bhagavad Gita. Karmendriyani sanyamya ya aste manasasmaran indriyathan vimudhatma mithyachara sa uchyate. Imagine a person seated in seems to be in deep meditation, perfect lotus posture, enviable lotus posture with both feet up on the thighs, eyes closed, maybe a nice long flowing beard, perfect jnana mudra. But he's deceiving himself the whole time. Vimudhatma, very strong language. The Gita usually refrains from using this kind of strong language, but two very harsh words are used. Vimudhatma, which is a very nice translation of, or a Sanskrit rendering of, a self-deceiver. Vimuda atma. Atma means self. Vimuda means deceived. The person who has deceived himself. But it gets worse. Krishna uses the word mithyachara. This person's a hypocrite. Why? Because no matter how impressive that lotus posture is and the mudras, instead of meditating on spiritual reality, on God or the self or some higher truth, he's thinking of sense objects, he or she. Thinking of worldly things. Why did she say that to me? Or I'm going to get back at her and this and that. Very common. Externally, people might be very impressed with you. And that feeds into the self-deception because people are praising you. Wow, you can't believe you can sit for 4 hours at a stretch. That's amazing. You can only sit for 15 minutes and then you get knee pain. And so it's very easy to deceive yourself about these things. Oh, 1 second. Sorry, I just flipped well past where I should be by accident. Okay, so another big problem, as I said, why is this so relevant for the present age? Because meditation is incredibly glamorous. Mindfulness retreats, mindfulness, meditation, these things are, these are Instagrammable. And you can get likes if it's a nice pose and... All right. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna, he understood all this. He distinguished, he would often bring in the paradigm of the three gunas, the three energies. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And he would often categorize people and spiritual aspirants in terms of these three gunas. And what he would often say is, Rajasika spiritual aspirants, he gives an example. He says it's like someone who is engaged in spiritual practice, but usually with an unconscious desire to impress other people, to get recognition, name and fame from doing those spiritual practices. So his example is it's somebody who, in the middle of a large assembly of people, will call on God very loudly and wear kind of loud clothes to attract attention to him or herself. And he says, by contrast, the sattvika spiritual aspirant is somebody who, in the middle of the night, in his or her mosquito net, because we're talking about India here, lots of mosquitoes, nobody knows that this person is engaged in spiritual practice, but that person is up meditating for most of the night. Might wake up a little late, people might criticize him and call him a lazy bum, and he won't say anything. Not a soul knows. Jesus, again, the connections are interesting with these great saints in different traditions. Jesus said what? Go to your room, shut the door behind you, and pray to God in private, and he will reward you openly, right? So the hard fact of the matter is that you can't make spiritual progress without renunciation. It's a big word, it's a daunting word, it's not a very pleasant word to hear. The moment you say renunciation, you lose about 98% of your followers. But what does renunciation mean? I think that's something worth reflecting on. It doesn't have to be external renunciation. Sometimes it does mean that. But more fundamentally, renunciation means renunciation of selfishness, renunciation of ego. So Swami Medhananda, he was a real radical, and I think we sometimes underappreciate. We don't appreciate enough how radical he was for his time. Not only in Indian context, but in a global context. But in Indian context, there are these two Sanskrit terms, nivritti and pravritti. Usually, traditionally, in Indian spiritual thought, pravritti means being a householder and trying to lead a spiritual life as a householder. And, or not necessarily even, but for those who are spiritual aspirants, as a householder. And nivritti means renouncing householder life to become a monk, and then you devote yourself full-time to spiritual practices. Swami Medhananda gives radically different definitions to these two terms to apply to all of us, whether we're monks, householders, somewhere in between. He says, pravritti, he says, go back to the etymology of the word. You'll see vrit, which means revolving really. And he says, pravritti, pra means revolving toward. And he says, revolving toward what? Revolving toward the ego and selfishness. So anything that makes us more egoistic and selfish is pravritti. It could even be so-called spiritual practices, but if we do it with the wrong attitude, that becomes worldly, and it becomes a source of ego. And nivritti is revolving away from egoism and selfishness. So a better definition, a broader definition of renunciation is nivritti in Swami Vivekananda's sense, which is you have to renounce. You have to try to at least minimize at first or diminish, fight with egoism and selfishness. In spiritual life, that's an absolute necessity. There's no avoiding that. So that's really important. That's if you really internalize that, then that's one way of kind of avoiding this danger of mistaking bhoga for yoga. So that's a lot, but I think it's really important to dwell on that because it's so pervasive and so dangerous. Third general way that we often tend to deceive ourselves as spiritual aspirants is what's nowadays called spiritual bypassing. The term was coined by an American psychotherapist named John Wellwood, and I'm going to give you his own definition of the term because the term is used, bandied about so much that it's kind of, people use it in different ways. This is his definition. This is the one that I like and I'm going to talk about. Spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. I think it's a very precise and helpful definition, and I think each of us should reflect on ourselves about whether we're indulging in this spiritual bypassing without knowing it. That's why self-deception. We don't even know when we're doing it. It's often unconscious, almost always unconscious. Spiritual bypassing is about avoiding rather than accepting, fundamentally. What are some examples? Spiritual escapism is a good example. Somebody who takes to spiritual life as a kind of escape from his or her problems in the world. This is very common, actually. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that there are different kinds of vairagya, different kinds of detachment. One kind of detachment comes and it's just momentary. He says it's the detachment of a monkey, markata vairagya. And it's exactly this. It's that person who is momentarily kind of disillusioned with the world, disenchanted with the world because of some unfortunate happenstance. That person lost his or her job, or his partner broke up with him or her, whatever it is. And then there's this momentary kind of like, I hate everything, let me become a monk or something. So this is actually Arjuna in Gita. He wanted to do this. He needs to fight in this war for justice. And he goes, nah, I'd rather become a monk. It's easier. I don't have to kill anyone. People will bow down at your feet. It's a nice life. That's spiritual escapism. That's one kind of spiritual bypassing. Arjuna is a good example of somebody who's a spiritual bypasser. But another thing is, people who are very, very insecure, for instance, have an inferiority complex. Some of them, what they do is they turn to spiritual life as a kind of way to validate themselves and to feel good about themselves. And even it's one thing that they can, brag to their friends about, even if the rest of their life is, or they feel somehow, they have very little self-esteem in other areas of life. They can say, I've got this at least. And that again, you need to deal with the root cause. Why are you insecure? Go back to, I don't know what it could be, childhood trauma, whether you're always trying to kind of live up to your parents' expectations or trying to imitate your older sibling, whatever, it could be anything. But be honest with yourself and get to the root of the problem. And just running off to a church or a temple is not going to solve your problems at that level. Again, I think Jesus sort of anticipated this phenomenon of spiritual bypassing. Matthew 5:23-24. He says, if you enter your place of worship and about to make an offering, you suddenly remember a grudge a friend has against you. Abandon your offering, leave immediately, go to this friend and make things right. Then and only then come back and work things out with God. I think this is a good example of spiritual bypassing, actually. Work the thing out with your friend and then come to God. And tell God, I did my best to deal with this issue, and now I'm offering what I've done to you, O Lord, at your lotus feet. A few caveats on this issue of spiritual bypassing. I'm not saying that you should avoid finding spiritual solutions to your worldly problems. In fact, it's always good to try to find spiritual solutions to worldly problems. But it's all about your inner attitude. Holy Mother used to say, Sharada Devi used to say, whatever it is you're going through, whatever troubles you're encountering, open your heart to God. Unburden yourself to God in prayer. In secret, not in front of others. How is this not spiritual bypassing? It's not spiritual bypassing, but the reason is because you're being honest about your issues. With whom? With God and with yourself. The problem with spiritual bypassing is that it's about escaping from your problems. When you're going to God with your troubles and you're honest about it, you're not escaping your problems, you're actually being very honest about your problems and saying, God, I can't do this on my own. That's why one of the first steps in AA is about saying I'm helpless on my own. I can't do this without a higher power, somebody greater than myself, or something greater than myself. And then I also want to add one more caveat, which is that, many of us come to spiritual life in many, many different ways, not always with the best of intentions or motives. That doesn't mean we're doomed. And it's possible that some of us come to spiritual life at first as a spiritual bypasser. And then we reflect after a few months or even years sometimes, and we ask ourselves, well, wait a minute, I was actually avoiding my problems. But then that doesn't mean that you then stop coming to Sunday talks. And no, you continue, except you purify your motive. And you follow the great saints and their advice and be honest with yourself, be honest with others, and sort of intensify and deepen your spiritual life and try to avoid spiritual bypassing while still remaining a spiritual aspirant. Okay? So, I've covered 3 main ways that we deceive ourselves. There are 2 more to cover before we get to each of the 4 specific yogas. The 4th one I call going through the motions in spiritual life. What do I mean? This kind of self-deception, I would call it a more innocent form of self-deception. More innocent, and for that reason, also harder to detect and harder to catch. Imagine that you have a guru. Many of us do if we're initiated. Your guru gives you certain instructions about what to do in your daily spiritual practice. You follow everything to the letter. Absolutely everything. But you do it mechanically. It's dry. There's no heart behind it. And yet, because you're doing everything your guru's telling you, you sort of get lulled into a sense of complacency. And the guru's happy because you're following what the guru's saying. So even when you go to your guru may not be very helpful to you. But all along, you're not making much spiritual progress. You're just going through the motions. The whole thing has become mechanical. Because the focus is more on the externals. Nowadays, this is also becoming a problem. Like in our tradition, if you're initiated, you're given a mantra and you're asked to do japa. That's one of the main practices. And you can get on Amazon, at least you can get in Amazon India. I bet you can get them here too. Electronic japa counters. I have one. It's nice actually. It has this hole for your finger and then you hold it like this and you turn the bead and there's a digital counter on it and it'll tell you how many times you've repeated the mantra. And some people just get carried away with it and they become very number focused, you know. And they're like, I want to do 20,000, or you might brag to your fellow spiritual aspirant, I did 30,000 repetitions today. How many did you do? To make others feel inadequate. This is a clear and present danger. Sri Ramakrishna, he noticed this particular tendency in a really spiritually evolved person, actually, Balaram Bosh's father. They were staunch Vaishnavas. Vaishnava means followers of the Vaishnava path with devotion toward Krishna at the center of the practice. And japa is mantra japa, repetition, mental repetition of the mantra is one of the most fundamental practices in Vaishnavism. So Balaram Bosh's father would come visit Sri Ramakrishna often. And as Vaishnavas are wont to do, they'll have this little bag, it's called a tholi in Bengali, and the rosary beads are inside, so it's not visible to others. And he's constantly repeating the mantra. So there's a room full of people, Sri Ramakrishna's room, 20, 30 people, maybe, I don't know how many people. And he's there in the corner, quietly doing his japa, not saying one word. And Sri Ramakrishna suddenly, in front of everybody, asks, you know, this guy's doing so much japa, why is it that he's not making any spiritual progress? This is recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. See, you might think that's mean or something, but he was a Jagat Guru, and so there was a reason why he did it. And the thing is, we should never judge. He was much more advanced than we are, most of us are. But there's this little thing left that he needed to overcome, and that's why he was saying this in that way, in front of everybody. He said, you know why he's not making spiritual progress? Instead of spending all day, it could be 18, 20 hours just doing this, repeating the mantra. He says, because there's no spirit of longing behind it. Vakulata in Bengali. The heart's not in it. He's just going through the motions. That's the fourth form of self-deception. And his father, Balaram Bosh's father, might be thinking to himself, I'm doing 18 hours of japa. Who else can do that much? That's that complacency. So you have to be careful about the inner spirit with which you engage in the spiritual practice, whatever it is. And then Sri Ramakrishna, just to kind of poke him a little bit more, he says, go to Kolkata, even the prostitutes there do japa. It's all about the inner spirit. And then, on another occasion, he notices another devotee named Hajra. Not so spiritually evolved, to be honest. But very proud of how much japa he does. So Sri Ramakrishna says, give me that. So he takes his rosary beads. Because Sri Ramakrishna has already realized he wouldn't do all that stuff. He took the beads in his right hand. He says, let me do what you're doing. His fingers wouldn't move. He couldn't do japa with his right hand. Then he said, let me do it with my left hand, which is considered inauspicious. I'm a lefty, so he takes it with the left hand, and he starts repeating the mantra. Once, twice, stops. Can't do it more than twice. Why? He soared into the transcendental plane of samadhi. And he comes back down and just thinks, I don't know how you guys do this, repeating a mantra. I can't do it. I repeat God's name once and I go into samadhi. So that means the inner spirit. That's the difference. Balaram Bosh his father doing it for 18, 20 hours a day and not making spiritual progress. Sri Ramakrishna doing it once or twice and going into samadhi. It's about quality, not quantity. So keep that in mind. Fifth way that we deceive ourselves, also very pervasive these days, but it goes back to the hippie movement in the 60s. Some of you may have been around at the time. Attaining so-called spiritual experiences through drugs. Very common. So common that I got roped into one thing almost by accident without knowing. I'm an academic philosopher, and so I was invited to Amsterdam. I should have known Amsterdam, but anyway. So I was invited to Amsterdam. There's a university called Leiden University, and they're holding a workshop called The Entropy of Mystical Experiences. And I thought, this is exciting work at the intersection of physics and neuroscience and psychology and spirituality and all this philosophy. So I went as an expert on the Vedanta side. And after attending this conference, I found that like 90% of them were interested in, either as scientists, which is kind of it's a burgeoning field actually, like scientific studies on drug use and its effects on the brain and its relation to spiritual life. And a lot of them are practitioners as well. And because I was a monk and wearing this, they would ask me, like, what do you think about drug use? And I give them the standard line. Let me tell you the standard line here. Let's go back to another great Indian scripture, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. 4.1. Janmaushadi mantra tapaha samadhijaha siddhayaha. Siddhis, meaning psychic powers, can arise due to birth, and by birth it means things that you've acquired through previous births, through spiritual practice in previous lives. Herbs, and here herb, we know herb means marijuana, but herb means drugs in general. Mantras, austerities, or meditation. All these ways you can acquire psychic powers. Psychic powers, notice. Not saying you can attain enlightenment through these things. And in the case of meditation, the aim is not cultivating these psychic powers, but sometimes psychic powers are a byproduct of engaging in genuine, sincere meditation. And then, to fast forward slightly ahead to 4.6, so 5 sutras later in the Yoga Sutra, the sutra runs, Tatra dhyanajam anashayam. Only meditation, of those 5 mentioned in 4.1, only meditation destroys the kleshas and thereby our karmic storehouse. These are technical terms. Klesha means the afflictions. What are the afflictions? There are 5 main ones. I'll just mention the first 3. Avidya, ignorance of our true nature as eternal spiritual entities. Raga and dvesha, attraction and aversion, likes and dislikes, strong desires, all these things. Only meditation destroys these kleshas and thereby helps us to destroy our remaining karma and thereby allowing us to attain the highest spiritual goal of life. Drugs can't do that. That's why Prabhupada, the founder of the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood, in his commentary on the Yoga Sutra, he says the following. He was in Hollywood during the hippie movement. Any attempt to take shortcuts to spiritual knowledge is exceedingly dangerous. One may, for example, obtain certain psychic experiences while under the influence of drugs. But such experiences so obtained can bring no lasting spiritual benefits. On the contrary, they are generally followed by a relapse into complete agnosticism and despair. So he makes a really interesting distinction between genuine spiritual experience and what he calls psychic experiences. And he's saying this on the basis of his own experiences. Interestingly, many of you might not know this, but when he was in India as a young monastic, on Shivaratri, which is the day of the worship of puja, of Shiva, bhang or siddhi is offered to Shiva, which is a kind of drug, THC-based drug, but in liquid form. He took some of that as prasad, which means after it was offered to Shiva, it becomes sanctified, takes it. Now, exactly how he took it and why he took it is there are conflicting accounts of this. One version is that, and I heard this from John Monday and Anna Monday, who actually heard this directly from Prabhupada. They say that he took the remnants of the Siddhi left in the cups of some of the great direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. And so you can't blame him for it, that kind of. But there's another version of the story, which is that he took one cup of Siddhi as prasad, like once it was sanctified, and then another monk offered him another cup, and he just said, okay, and then he took another. Any case, he took way too much, and he had never done drugs in his life. And his first response was, some of you might be able to relate, he said, I'm going to die. I'm not kidding. I'm going to die. And he just started saying, Jai Shri Ram Krishna, Jai Shri Ram Krishna, Jai Shri Ram Krishna. And now the other monks in the room are starting to get worried. So they call the doctor, and one of the monks pours cold water over him, and he starts singing a devotional song, comes back down to his senses. And then he says, he started looking around him, and he saw the people in the room, the other monks there, as lighted. I mean, it seems like he's discerning a kind of aura around them. Even more interestingly, when they call the doctor finally, the doctor comes, the doctor's a good friend of his, but he can't bear to look at him. Why? Because he doesn't see that aura, he sees the opposite of it, a kind of darkness hovering over him and around him, a dark aura. And he just found it so off-putting and unpleasant. He just took whatever medicine and then told him to go. And then, after the drug high wore off, and it took 3 days for it to completely go, I mean, it was kind of intense. He had spiritual dryness for 6 months. And what did he mean by spiritual dryness? He lost faith in God and spiritual life. He didn't become a householder or something, but it was a dark night of the soul for him. And so it was on the basis of his own experiences that he said this, that he warned against drug use in spiritual life. There's another connection, which is very relevant here. I'm speaking on these very premises, Ramakrishna Monastery. Actually, this started out, many of you know this, as Trabuco College, founded by whom? Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd. Both very devoted to Vedanta and to Swami Prabhupada, but both of them experimented with mescaline, LSD. And Aldous Huxley went so far as to write an entire book, which became extraordinarily famous in this drug movement, called The Doors of Perception. So famous that Jim Morrison of The Doors fame named his band after the book. And Swami Prabhupada was furious at both of them and blamed these two very prominent intellectuals for perpetuating and propagating and spreading what Christopher Isherwood, another disciple of Prabhupada, called a deadly heresy. Isherwood himself, in his book, My Guru and His Disciple, he records it. He said that Prabhupada strongly felt that drug use in spiritual life was a deadly heresy. The real test of whether an experience is a genuinely spiritual experience is whether it's transformative to our character, whether it changes how we behave with others, whether it makes us less selfish, less egoistic, more ethical, better human beings. That's the ultimate test. That's the ultimate test. And you'll often find, almost always, with drug experiences, you come back the same damn person you were going into it. And whereas Swami Vivekananda says, by contrast, when a man goes into samadhi, if he goes into it a fool, he comes out a sage. So I add these caveats. So there is a caveat here. Just as spiritual bypassing is one way of getting into spiritual life, and then you kind of purify your motives and realize that, wait a minute, I was kind of going astray, now let me be a more sincere spiritual aspirant. I think the same thing can be said about drug use in spiritual life. Some people are first introduced to spiritual life and its possibilities through a drug experience. That's possible. I don't think there's any denying that. And I don't think it's fair to just dismiss that as invalid, especially because it's so common. I don't encourage it, but for some people, especially people who are very kind of rigid and hidebound, it might be a drug experience that leads them to kind of just open their mind to possibilities beyond the ego and beyond themselves, to transcendental possibilities. Even if that's the case, if you're sincere, you have to stop doing it. That could be an entry point, but you can't continue. I'm giving you, of course there are different views on this, and we could argue if you want later, but I'm giving you our line on it. And what are some of the dangers in drug use in spiritual life? Well, one, we're handing over control and agency to a physical substance. Whether that's natural or chemical, doesn't matter. Whether it's LSD made in the lab or whether it's psychedelic mushrooms or ayahuasca, doesn't matter. It's a physical substance, you're surrendering yourself to it. That is not the way to make spiritual progress. Second, depending on the drug, there are varying degrees of addiction, possibilities of addiction to the drug. Extremely dangerous in spiritual life. Third, this is the danger of all spiritual shortcuts, is that you have these experiences that you're not ready for, that the body and mind are not prepared for. You're not mature enough to handle and to assimilate those experiences. It can make you go crazy, and there are more and more cases of this with drug use. It can make you mentally unbalanced, and it can ruin your mental balance. Remember the 15%. Remember, we should be haunted by Swami Vivekananda's 15% go crazy. Fourth danger is proneness to self-deception, because it's very easy, especially in the midst of a drug high, to think that I see God. I've heard this so many times. I see God everywhere. I see God in everything. It's incredible, man. You should do it. Look, I'm not one to judge, but the point is, it's very easy to mistake a hallucination for a spiritual experience. Very, very easy. And finally, what both the Yoga Sutra and what Swami Prabhupada and the other great monks of order say is drug experience are never transformative. They can never genuinely transform you as a human being from an ethical and spiritual standpoint. You have to come back to earth, and it's not fun, it's not glamorous, but it can be joyous once you get a taste for it. Spiritual practice. There's no getting around having to engage in spiritual practice. So just remember, Jesus, what did he say? He said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Not blessed are those who take LSD or ayahuasca, for they shall see God. Just remember that, pure in heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. All right, so before we get on to the 4 yogas, I want to just summarize very briefly. 5 main ways we deceive ourselves. First, when we assess ourselves, our assessment is overly flattering. We exaggerate our own strengths and minimize or downplay our own weaknesses. Second, mistaking bhoga for yoga. Mistaking the path of enjoyment for the path of perfection. Third, spiritual bypassing. Escaping our issues in the world by retreating into spiritual life. Fourth, going through the motions. We're doing everything right, following our gurus to the T, and yet we're not making progress because our whole spiritual practice has become mechanical. There's no spirit behind it. There's no inner aspiration for the divine, for higher reality. And fifth, using drugs as a kind of shortcut to enjoying spiritual experiences. All right. Now, let's look at the 4 yogas. What are the 4 yogas? Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion toward God. Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, detached works. And fourth, Raja Yoga, the path of meditation and concentration. Let's start with Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. First of all, there's an issue of what exactly Jnana Yoga means. Many people think it has a unitary meaning. That's not the case, actually. Ramanuja, for instance, understands Jnana Yoga in one way. Shankara understands it in a very different way, and there are other ways that people use it. I want to just focus on the classical Advaitic practice of Jnana Yoga, how classical Advaita Vedantins, followers of Shankara, use the term and practice it. What's their main practice? It's Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. It means listen from a qualified guru to the great sayings from the Upanishads. Tattvam Asi, for instance, is one of them. You are nothing but non-dual pure consciousness. It's a mistake to think that you're a body or a mind. You're actually non-dual pure consciousness. Then reflect on it, manana, and then deeply try to meditate on that and kind of internalize and assimilate that teaching into your daily life. That's it. That's the practice of Jnana Yoga that I want to focus on today. Now, let's go back to one of the great founders, if not founder, at least codifier, and one of the greatest exponents of classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankaracharya, Shankara. I've already mentioned him earlier. In the very beginning of his commentary on Brahma Sutra, 1.1.1, Atato Brahma Jigyasa, And now begins the inquiry into Brahman. He asks, who is eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge? And he gives a list so daunting that if people read it, they would be like, wow, I'm definitely not eligible. The vast majority of human beings, if they were honest with themselves, would say it. Shankara says you have to be fully equipped with what he calls sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold spiritual practice. And what are those? Spiritual attainments, really. Intense viveka, perfect viveka, which means discernment, being able to distinguish between the true and the false, between the path of perfection and the path of enjoyment. Most of us fail right at that step. Second, intense vairagya, detachment toward all worldly temptations, attachments, pleasures. The third one, shat sampat, the 6 spiritual treasures. Perfect ability to control the senses, from preventing them from going out toward the world. Perfect control of the mind. I mean, these are very high-level things. And finally, and there are 4 other treasures. I'm not going to go into it. We don't have time. And the fourth and final prerequisite for even getting off the ground with Jnana Yoga, mumukshutva, intense mumukshutva. That's a Sanskrit term which means an intense desire to be liberated from the cycle of rebirth. How many of us can honestly say that we're fully equipped with this fourfold sadhana? And Sri Ramakrishna, and Shankara, what he would say is, if you're not eligible, be honest with yourself, don't practice Jnana Yoga, stick to Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion and the path of selfless action. Sri Ramakrishna, much later, he echoes Shankara on this point. Let me quote exactly what he says. Sri Ramakrishna says, the feeling I am he, and he here meaning, so I am non-dual pure consciousness. He's thinking of Jnana Yoga here. The feeling I am he is not wholesome. A person who entertains such an idea while looking on his body as the self causes himself great harm. He cannot go forward in spiritual life. He drags himself down. He deceives himself as well as others. Nijike tokai or onnodero tokai. He cannot understand his own state of mind. Notice the last sentence. This is a paradigmatic case of self-deception. He doesn't even know that he's deceiving himself. He thinks he's a great follower of the path of knowledge. He's, I am Brahman, I'm non-dual pure consciousness, but he's the same old dude that he was before. And the danger is he's not only fooling himself, he's deceiving others. Sri Ramakrishna, he learned this from experience because there's an incident when there's a sadhu from a different state outside of West Bengal came to Dakshineshwar, and Sri Ramakrishna heard about him, and heard that even though he was a monk, a sannyasi, he was having an affair with a woman. So he approached this monk. And he says, what is this I hear about this lady that you're with? He said, and with a smile on his face, completely just unperturbed. He said, oh, let me explain. You see, everything is Maya. Now, if everything is a dream, how can my affair with that woman alone be real? It's also part of Maya. And then what does Sri Ramakrishna say? What Sri Ramakrishna says is so strongly worded that it's kind of watered down by Chetanandaji and other translators. The watered down version is, I spit on your Vedanta. The actual version is, I piss on your Vedanta. Okay. So, why is this relevant? Because in the past few decades, Neo-Advaita has become all the rage. Neo-Advaita. Many of these are, or claim to be, followers of great Advaitic saints like Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj. Nobody can doubt their spiritual credentials and their attainments. But what these Neo-Advaitans do is they lift the eligibility requirements. They don't read Shankara. First of all, I really think that they would benefit from just actually going back to their source. Read Shankara, for goodness sakes. They don't do that. And they say that it's not necessary. Eligibility requirements, that's all part of Maya too. See, notice the trick that they play. All doing is part of Maya. We don't even have to do anything. Why do you want to do anything? So let me give you an example from my own life. When I finished my PhD in 2009, and then I wanted to be a monk in India, and so I moved to India. One-way ticket to India, and I'm on a 6-month pilgrimage, and I go to different places throughout India. I find myself in Kodaikanal in Tamil Nadu. And I walk into a bakery, and the woman working there looks at me, and I'm wearing this kind of clothes except in white, because I'm not a sannyasi yet. I hadn't joined, just a few months before joining the order. And then she says, oh, what are you up to? And I said, well, I'm on a pilgrimage, and I'm going to join the Ramakrishna order soon. I want to be a sannyasi. And she looked at me with a smile and she said, oh, why go to all that trouble? I'm a follower of Ramana Maharshi. And he taught us to just dive into the Atman. The Atman means the non-dual self. So why don't you just dive into the Atman? As if it were that easy. That's the problem. Everybody wants it easy in spiritual life. I just did a podcast interview with Rick Archer. His podcast is called Buddha at the Gas Pump. And we talked a lot about this issue of the dangers of Neo-Advaita and lifting eligibility requirements. And so if you're interested, you can look at that podcast on YouTube. And he told me that he started a foundation, an association for spiritual integrity. He invited Sarvapyanji as one of the speakers to give a talk on the ethical foundations of non-dual spirituality, just to emphasize to people that, the path of knowledge is by no means easy, and most of you are not even qualified to even practice it. So that's the biggest danger in Jnana Yoga, but I want to get to the other three practices at least briefly. And then, of course, positive solutions and kind of how do we overcome self-deception. Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action. We know that this is the famous teaching in the Bhagavad Gita, karma nyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. Your duty is to, or what you have the right to is your duty, the duty that falls on you, but not to the fruits of that action. So don't be attached to the fruits, don't covet the fruits, but also don't get overly attached to the work itself. That's also really important. How do we do that? The best way and simplest way is to offer whatever you do to God. So Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga they kind of go hand in hand. But Sri Ramakrishna warns us, Karma Yoga is much easier said than done. He says to work in a spirit of detachment is known as Karma Yoga, but it is very difficult. And then he explains why. You may think you are working in a detached spirit, but attachment creeps into the mind from nobody knows where. You may worship in the temple, or arrange a grand religious festival, or feed many poor and starving people. Look at how noble the examples are. All of these are kind of spiritual, wonderful things. You may think you have done all this without hankering after the results, but unknown to yourself, self-deception, unknown to yourself, the desire for name and fame has somehow crept into your mind. Complete detachment from the results of action is possible only for one who has seen God. I mean, that's how difficult it is to practice Karma Yoga perfectly, which doesn't mean we shouldn't practice Karma Yoga. Be aware of the dangers of self-deception. Be honest with yourself. And notice that all of his examples are pious spiritual activities. Even doing those things, we can be deceiving ourselves. And there's still ego behind it, lurking behind there without us knowing it. Raja Yoga. I'm skipping some stuff because I don't want to go on too long. So, Raja Yoga. This is the path of meditation and concentration. You find this in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, for instance. But there are many different kinds of paths here. Even mindfulness will fall under Raja Yoga. As I said before, there's a lot of glamour and kind of prestige in this path, which is one of its dangers, I think, because it's so easy to kind of convince yourself that everything is going great because other people are praising you and you're getting lots of likes on the pictures that you're posting about your spiritual life. People will ask you, how long do you meditate for? And you can confidently say 5 hours a day, and like, wow, man, I wish I could meditate that long. A senior monk once told me, he said that this is a great danger in spiritual life, is when you meditate and other people, they notice you, they see you, and they start talking about, praising you maybe behind your back to yourself. And he says what ends up happening is that your spiritual life becomes more about impressing others than about actually making spiritual progress. In Bangla, there's a phrase for this, life dekhano. Bengalis, almost all Indian languages, they incorporate English words. So this is life. Life is just life. Dekhano means showing your life, your spiritual life to others, instead of actually living it quietly and privately. So I think that's the danger. That's one danger. The second danger is another one of these kind of common things these days is everybody and their mother seems to think that their kundalini has been awakened. So it's a real danger. It's prematurely and kind of naively and immaturely thinking that you've made drastic spiritual progress just because you do a little pranayama, a little breath work, and you feel some sensations, and the serpent has awoken. Another danger. And fourth, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. Sri Ramakrishna himself would recommend this over all other paths. I'll quote from the Gospel. The best path for this age is Bhakti Yoga, the path of bhakti prescribed by Narada, to sing the name and glories of God and pray to him with a longing heart. O God, give me knowledge, give me devotion, and reveal thyself to me. So we might think, well, maybe this is the one yoga that's free from any risk of self-deception. No, but we'd be wrong. No, he recommended it as the best path for most people because there's less of a risk of self-deception because there are certain built-in sort of practices that help us to avoid self-deception. I think that's one of the reasons why he recommended it so much. There are other reasons too. But let me count the ways in which Bhakti Yoga can also be a source of self-deception. This is very common. All these things are common. I encounter them often. One is, among bhaktas, those who are devotees, being overly glib about God. And, oh, everything is mother's will. By mother's will, I got this and that. They're saying it, but do they really feel it? Or are they deceiving themselves? And I'm not saying don't say that. It's really up to you. But if you find yourself sort of saying it a little bit too much and you're not actually, examine yourself and ask yourself, do I really feel it when I say it? Sri Ramakrishna has a story in the gospel where he says there's this simple villager who was falsely accused of a crime and he's put on trial. And the attorney on the prosecutor is grilling him with questions. And then what do you do? And he said, Ramarichai, by Rama's will, I got off my chair. By Rama's will, I did this. And he explains the whole thing. And the people were so just disarmed by just how simple he was. He had that genuine feeling that literally everything he was doing was by Rama's will. But how many of us really have that feeling of complete guilelessness and simplicity and total surrender to God? Almost none of us. But a lot of us talk about surrender and God's grace, by Mother's grace, by God's will. So that's one danger in the path of bhakti. Another danger is sentimentalism. Becoming overly emotional and especially mistaking momentary emotions for spiritual experiences. This is something Swami Medhananda talked about. He says there's a danger to the receiving soul of its mistaking momentary emotions for real religious yearning. And he says we may study that in ourselves. We may study that in ourselves. And so this is, I'm anticipating one of the main strategies for overcoming self-deception. Just analyze yourself and be mindful as you engage in spiritual practices. And a third danger in bhakti yoga is one-sidedness and fanaticism. As you go deep into your particular devotional practice, it usually involves being devoted to a particular form of the ultimate reality, a particular form of the personal God, something like that. Krishna, Kali, Christ, whatever it is. But the danger here is that you go deep at the expense of broadness. And you start looking down on other people. That itself becomes, then your bhakti yoga becomes a source of ego in its own right. Okay, so finally, 3 concrete methods for overcoming self-deception. And I have to be brief, unfortunately. All right, in the gospel, somebody asks Sri Ramakrishna, Upay ki. So what is a way to make spiritual progress and to avoid self-deception? He says, Prarthana o shodashod vichar. He says 2 things, prayer and vichara, distinguishing between the real and the unreal, the path of perfection from the path of enjoyment. These are two of the 3 things I want to mention. So the first thing, sat asad vichara. Mindfulness, discernment. This is something that all these great saints are emphasizing again and again. Be self-reflective, be mindful of yourself and how you're engaging in spiritual practices and with what attitude you're engaging in these spiritual practices. Catch yourself in the act of self-deception. Second, prayer. Remember that you're not alone. Call on God to guide you and to help you. That's why Sri Ramakrishna, when he gives his own prayer as an example of prayer, he says, "Oh Mother, first give me Shuddha Bhakti, pure love for your lotus feet. Secondly, don't bewitch me with your world-bewitching Maya. Don't delude me with your world-bewitching Maya." Okay. And finally, third, try to combine the 4 yogas to the best of your ability instead of just exclusively focusing on one and practicing one. If you combine them, they actually help correct for the dangers and defects of each path. And so, for instance, if Jnana Yoga is your main practice, you can combine them with Bhakti Yoga and the other paths. What will that do? It'll keep you grounded and humble. You'll be a karma yogi, you'll be serving others, you'll be a bhakti yogi, you won't look down on those who have belief in God and say that's based on blind faith, you're stupid. With bhakti yoga as your main practice, combine it with jnana yoga, mindful, and raja yoga. Raja yoga, mindfulness falls under it. Be more self-aware. Try to catch yourself when you're talking about God's will. Do you really believe that you've surrendered to God or not? If karma yoga is your main practice, try to consciously combine karma yoga with bhakti yoga, first of all, which is great because you can offer everything you do to God, but also be mindful And so combine Jnana Yoga and Raja Yoga, integrate that into your practice as well. And be mindful as you engage in Karma Yoga. Analyze your motives and ask yourself, am I really doing this selflessly, or is there some ego in it? Is there some desire for recognition? And finally, with Raja Yoga, if that's your main practice, combine it with Karma Yoga and get out there and serve others. That's very, very helpful to check ego. And Bhakti Yoga. Pray, because prayer is one of the most potent means of avoiding self-deception and spiritual ego. Thank you.